and welcome to today's program. As the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston hosts a conversation with Ambassador David Rank, head of the China practice at the Cohen Group, a global business strategy consultancy. I am Miriam Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and it's our hope that you and your families are all healthy and safe. We're glad you joined us today, and I want to invite all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can watch all of our upcoming programs, including next week's. We will have the Consulate General of Norway in Houston, Hilda Skorpen, and also you won't want to miss our great program with Joshua Landis on Syria. So just remember, ring the little bell on your screen to subscribe, and our programs will be delivered directly to your email inbox. Now more than ever, it's important to stay informed about what's happening not only in your city and in your region, but all around the world. And the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings foreign affairs experts right into your home. For those who are new to the Council, you can find a listing of all of our upcoming programs at our website at wachouston.org. Also, we're excited to announce that this summer, we are planning to host the Council's first Global Scholars Academy. It's going to be a summer program for middle and high school students who have a passion for international affairs. So if you know of a student, or you are one, and you're interested, please visit our website for more information. And now on to today's program. Having served in several foreign service assignments across China, including former Deputy Chief of Mission and Acting Ambassador to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and now currently head of the China practice at the Cohen Group, joining the Council's own Ronan O'Malley, please welcome Ambassador David Rank. Ambassador, it's a pleasure having you with us.
Thanks, man. Good to be back.
Yes, indeed, and thank you very much, Rayanne, and good afternoon to all of you members, guests, students, and teachers, and thank you all again for joining us. And I'm delighted and honored to have Ambassador Rank with us again. Thank you very much for joining us at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Last time it was in person. The next time I hope it'll be in person as well. But for now, we're delighted to have you by video. And as Marianne touched upon, perhaps more than almost anyone we've certainly hosted, and a lot of people, in your 30 years at the State Department, you've had 6 different postings to Greater China, 4 in mainland China and 2 in Taiwan. You're fluent at Mandarin, and obviously an insider, a high-level insider of the U.S. State Department, and great understanding of U.S.-China relations. Before we get into our specific discussion today of China and COVID-19 and its impacts for U.S. and beyond, could you maybe just briefly, for people who have maybe heard of it but not as familiar about it, talk about the transition? Obviously, a lot of people know about the kind of horrors and repression of Mao, the kind of opening of Deng Xiaoping, but really say the last 10 or 20 years, what China has gone through in terms of its enormous, incredible economic growth, but politically, that has been a challenge.
Sure. Thank you, Ronan, first of all. And it is really good to be back with the people of Houston, or at least to be seen by some subset of them. It is a strange time we are going through, but it's great, and it's great that organizations like yours are continuing to sort of keep engaged with the world, because it's easy, as we're all socially distancing, to sort of focus on the very narrow and the very nearby. So maybe I'll look at 30 years ago, just because that's really when I showed up in China for the first time. And China was at that point sort of emerging from what you described as the almost madness of Mao, and really a politically driven system where politics was the sort of the operative element in society. And Deng, after the death of Mao, there was a struggle for power and a struggle for the direction of the country, which Mao died in '76, and it wasn't until in the early 1990s that Deng finally won the struggle over should do economics or politics take the lead, and it was Deng and the idea that economics should drive China's future, and that was really for I would say until probably 2008, the global financial crisis. That was the driving motive behind China's governance, was to grow the economy, And as part of that, the recognition that it required China to open up to the world, to liberalize and to get the state out of the system, out of the economy. I would say that turned around in 2008 as the world reacted to the global financial crisis. What China did was it pumped money into its state-owned enterprises, and it looked at infrastructure investment as a way to avoid the serious downturn that the rest of the world saw, and it worked. As the rest of the world went into deep recession, China continued to grow. It was only until this last quarter when you saw China go into sort of technical recession, or at least what looks like the coming recession. So that was 2008. 2012, Xi Jinping comes on the scene, and another shift from Deng. I would say the pendulum starts swinging back, and politics starts becoming much more important. And the idea that Deng had that over centralization of power into one individual was a bad thing. Deng saw that as one of the major failings of Mao. Xi Jinping obviously sees that quite differently, and is quite happy to centralize power in himself. Thank you very much. But what I would say unified Mao and Deng and Xi is that all of them had a vision of China returning to what they and a lot of Chinese people see as China's rightful place in the world, a rich, strong, powerful country, and certainly the most powerful country in Asia, the sort of organizing principle around which Asia operates.
And a lot of people call it different things. I don't know, maybe you could say how you would describe it. Some people call it a hybrid capitalist, Leninist, communist model, which sounds like an oxymoron. You have an incredibly strong and controlling state, but also almost the Wild West when it comes to the economy in some aspects. How does the Chinese government explain that to the people, that we're still a communist country, quote unquote, but we also have more billionaires in the last 20 years than any country in the world? How is that explained? And as long as economic growth continues, do you think the Chinese people are willing to tolerate it?
Yeah, so I think, and Xi Jinping is grappling with this. He sees the concern that the Communist Party has lost the risk that it will lose its authority. He sees that as a real risk, not just to the Communist Party, but to China's prospects overall. I think most Chinese people are pretty sophisticated. They understand that the Communist Party, that there is a deal out there, that the party remains in power, and in exchange for that, it focuses on governance and improving the lives of ordinary people. And for a long time, that was really easy, that it was essentially just focus on GDP. And China did a great job of that. Annual growth rates, although the statistics aren't entirely reliable. If you went to the place in 1990 and you went now, that it has seen a remarkable 30 years of growth, and that for a long time was enough. That for most Chinese people, just getting 10% richer every year was enough. It's gotten harder in the last decade or so because richer people want more. They want clean air, they want clean government, they want clean water, good schools, and those are all just harder to deliver, and there's a challenge. The other thing that's become harder for Xi is that the old growth models aren't working as well anymore. Just pumping money into state-owned enterprises isn't working so well, isn't working like it used to. Infrastructure, they've got all the airports and the high-speed rail they need, and it's just harder to find a good place to invest money. So that's getting much harder. The Communist Party, you described it, I think, well, with a capitalist Leninist state, which is, the capitalism is largely the driving force for the economy, with Leninism, which is the political organizing structure of you have a single party that controls things, including the major areas of the economy.
And maybe just briefly, you touched upon it, some of it already, that obviously some people would say since Mao, the President Xi is the strongest and most potentially autocratic ruler in China, has had in 40 years. Can you just talk briefly about what are some of the examples, extensions of term limits, this kind of building of a cult of personality, how much is it the anti-corruption campaign, how much of that is to stop actual corruption or consolidate power? Can you talk briefly about what he's doing to consolidate power?
Sure. Well, you've talked about a couple of them, and the big one, I would say, I mean, I guess overall, he's rolling back some of the guardrails that Deng Xiaoping put in place after Mao. So the big one was the what had been a consensus that general secretaries, the party secretary, only serve two 5-year terms, and that the state president role goes along with that. So now that has been rolled back, which it has. It's really hard to see how you get back to a normal transition of power, because under Mao, even if had he wanted to leave, he had the act of designating a successor is in itself destabilizing, and I think Xi Jinping is going to find that too. Even if he wants to leave, as he tries to designate a successor, not that I think he wants to, but that will bring out the infighting that is almost, I think, definitional for that kind of authoritarian Leninist state, that people who aren't at the top fight to get to the top. So that's a big one. I would say China has reformed sort of the ability of citizens to do what they want, read what they want, I hate to think of it and describe it in terms of rights, because in the Chinese system, you don't actually have an awful lot of rights, just the ability to do things. That ability has constricted quite a bit under Xi Jinping. He has, early on, the Communist Party, and certainly under Xi, saw the importance of, early it was controlling the media. Under Xi Jinping, it's controlling the internet. And that, certainly the space for open debate on the internet has become much, much narrower under Xi Jinping. I will say a plug for a book that people who, if you are, for example, stuck at home and have lots of time to read, you should read Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, where he talks about one of the big threats to humanity is government empowered by technology to surveil the population. And I think it's a really, some of the things you see going on in China are alarming in not just for what's happening there, but for the potential for technology as a tool of control.
And lastly, I'm going to turn in just a moment to questions specifically related to COVID-19. Obviously, you have a large part of your career with the State Department in China, an awful lot of work directly with our intelligence assets, especially as the charge d'affaires and the acting ambassador. You would meet with our CIA analysts regularly. Do you agree with the supposition a lot of people say that no matter what we think or feel about the Chinese government, that it is still one of the hardest places to get a true understanding or kind of good snapshot of what's going on at the highest levels of politics?
Yeah, look, it is incredibly difficult to know. I consoled myself when I was in government that not only did I not know, but ordinary Chinese didn't know, really well-informed Chinese didn't know that the nature of those systems is that they're very closed, that there are decisions are made at a very high level by a very small handful of people. Who by nature do not share. And so I think the way to judge China, the way to judge most countries is not by what it says, but by what it does. And so ultimately, it would be interesting to know what Chinese leaders are thinking at a particular time. It is useful to listen to what they're saying, but I think it's most instructive to watch what they're doing.
All right, and turning to COVID-19 specifically, in February, U.S. intelligence, I think, briefed the White House, and I think later came out in different New York Times and other American newspapers that American intelligence believes the Chinese statistics that are being reported were vastly underreported with regards to the outbreak. Could you discuss that, and also the idea that In some ways, unfortunately, the Chinese political model might have initially helped slow down a response to COVID-19 because it's a system in which you're rewarded for doing the goals of the party and succeeding. And anyone at a lower level, at a provincial level or a city level, might have been afraid to report we have this new strange virus because they might lose their job.
Absolutely. I mean, the start of the virus, of the outbreak, it was, I mean, almost a textbook Chinese scenario where you had a small outbreak in the city of Wuhan. It was, it's a city of 11 million people in a region of probably 300 million people. A small outbreak, and the instinct of every Chinese official is to make it go away, is to sort of bury the bad news, try to shuttle the people off who are involved, to get them out of the way, and especially because it was coming up on the Spring Festival, the Chinese New Year, and just to make things look as good as possible. And so sort of the Chinese system is in a way designed to incubate that kind of problem, not designed to incubate the disease, but to have those diseases pop up like it did. As far as covering up the numbers, yes, part of I think what's going on is that Chinese officials don't like to report bad news, and a lot of numbers, that some of the deaths aren't tallied for that reason. I think part of the thing is, you look at New York, they just increased their death toll by 50% because people were dying at home, and say whatever you want about the Chinese response. Once they knew they had a problem on their hands, the response they took was pretty astounding. I mean, they essentially locked up a city of 11 million people, told people, and they have the ability fairly efficiently to do so, to tell them you're not going to leave your house, so that you had a lot of people who died at home who apparently had the disease, but had not tested because they had the same kind of testing problems we did, and so died at home, and because they'd never tested positive for the disease, they weren't counted as having died of coronavirus. I think every country will look back and sort of have to figure out the forensics of what was the actual death rate. I think China's going to be much harder. I think China's numbers are going to, because of the transparency issues there, are going to be one that forensic examination won't be public like it will be in the US, but also they'll find that a lot more people died than were officially reported at the start.
And perhaps whatever difficulties China ran into with first containing the virus in Wuhan and beyond, China's global response since then has been, would you say, fairly impressive? What have they done in a lot of ways to kind of take the lead in terms of global leadership? Especially people in the region would say the United States walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China's willing to pump huge amounts of aid and also other forms of influence all across, not just the region, but the world. Do you think this is kind of almost become an opening for China in some ways for global leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think they clearly see it as a chance to burnish their credentials and to distract from the other conversation, which is where did the virus start, and why, what went wrong in the Chinese system that allowed it to break out like it did. But it cuts both ways. China has done, I think they have obviously spent a lot of time trying to get good publicity, and I think I have to give them credit for legitimately trying to get supplies out to places that need it, to bolster global efforts to fight the disease and get equipment to people who need it. But they've also had some missteps, and putting yourself forward as sort of the I don't want to say global savior, but as an example means you got to do it really well, and instances of shipping masks that weren't actually N95 masks. There have been lots of stumbles and hiccups on the way. But I think of that as sort of welcome to global leadership. It's tough. People grade you at a much tougher scale than if you are just a mid-level country.
And maybe just 2 or 3 more, relatively quick questions before we turn it to the audience. Can you talk about how this has impacted the U.S.-China relationship and maybe kind of for the United States and perhaps beyond in terms of the economy? Is this making a lot of countries and companies reconsider having a large percentage of their exports only coming from one country, or vital, components in their supply chain only coming from one country? What do you think the longer term, turnout will be from this?
Yeah, I think it will be, when all is said and done, what's the old saying? A lot more will be said than done. I think people are looking at what's going on. People who are sourcing from China and realizing that it is a vulnerability. And I think there are some companies that prided themselves on really lean supply chains, one link, one single point of failure the entire way through the supply chain, and they're just taking a beating right now. But the flip side of that is, if you're an American company, it's not plausible to bring all of your manufacturing back to the U.S. I'm talking before COVID-19. We were 3.5% unemployment. We were essentially at absolutely full employment, and shipping all of this stuff, and because of consumer demand in the United States, and it's just not plausible that all of that's going to come back here. So people, if we're going to have the kind of standard of living that, or something that approaches it that we had, before COVID-19, that means we're going to have global supply chains, and China is just really good at delivering what global supply chains look at. So I think they'll be part of the equation for the indefinite. The question is on certain things, on things that are absolutely essential for critical emergencies. We've seen the gaps in supply chains, we've seen problems, and I think that's where, sort of like after September 11th, the government went back and said, okay, what went wrong? What specific steps do we need to take? I think that's coming at some point, and say, where are we really vulnerable, and what do we have to make sure we have as a matter of, frankly, national security here in the U.S.
Okay, and last quick question, I want to turn it over to the audience. Can you talk about how much of a factor, or if you think it will be much of a factor at all, these last few months will have upon the average Chinese person's confidence and trust, both in President Xi and also more broadly the Communist Party?
Yeah, I think there was a really angry debate in China. I don't know if people may have seen the story about this Dr. Li Wenliang, a doctor in Wuhan who saw it very early on, warned his colleagues, said, there's a new virus out here. It's really dangerous. We've got to get the word out. He was admonished by the party, told to sign a statement, agree to shut up and do his job, essentially. He died of the disease, and that really sparked an outpouring of anger. There's since, with all of the U.S.-China arguing over, all sorts of things in the bilateral relationship, that has been sort of drawn out. But I don't think people will forget that. I think that's, it was a really searing moment for a lot of Chinese that this is how our system works, and they know it. People understand how the system works, but to be reminded of it in that sort of really stark way, I don't think that goes away. Now there's the Beijing is trying to make the case that that only the Communist Party, only the Chinese state as constituted could have avoided what's happening in Italy or Spain or the United States. Much worse, much higher death rates. Economic damage potentially much higher here, because they say the way the PRC, the way the CCP, the Communist Party responded.
And maybe just a note, you'd mentioned it to me earlier, just so people realize, a democratic and functioning society, what was the result in Taiwan in the last few months?
Right, thanks for, I spend a lot of time working with Taiwan too. It's really impressive. Talk about being exposed to China. There are about 1 million Taiwanese live full or part-time in the mainland. Very close, deeply integrated. As in fact, before Chinese authorities were really recognizing the extent of the problem, Taiwan started moving. They cut off travel. Before Wuhan recognized that there was human-to-human transfer, Taiwan cut off travel from Wuhan to the island. They put in place a number of steps from lessons they learned from SARS back in 2003. The last time I looked, it was about a week ago. Taiwan had 6 deaths and a few hundred cases, fewer than 1,000 cases. This isn't in a country, in a place that's just, a few miles away from the epicenter of the disease. So governance matters, and it's not. It doesn't have to be authoritarian governance. It's just competent governance is what matters.
And let me just turn to the audience questions. A good question from one of our longtime members, Paul. He asked, and it's a good question. It hasn't just happened in China, but I think a lot of people may be seeing the clean canals in Venice, or I think even here in San Antonio, the Riverwalk's gotten cleaner. He asked, given improving air quality in China so far this year, what are the prospects for a green economy rebound in China in the next few years?
So I wish I were really optimistic. If you I talk to friends in Beijing, and they say, "Oh, the air's great. Traffic's great now because of the restrictions in place." But my gut instinct is that what's going to happen is, the playbook that Beijing has is, if they have to, and the economy. I don't know if you all saw probably some people saw the GDP numbers coming out of China. It dropped for the first time in more than 30 years. Of 7% almost in the first quarter of 2020. And the way Beijing will look at, I think, getting things going again is turning to its old playbook, going to state-owned enterprises, and those tend to be concentrated in heavy industries. And I fear that will cause things to bounce back, particularly since, the U.S. having pulled out of Paris, we were the ones holding Chinese feet to the fire on emissions and a lot of other environmental issues. We're not there doing that now, and without the pressure of that, and with the pressure to get things going, I think we'll go back to dirty.
I see, and related to that and your economic points, another longtime member of ours, TD, asks. I know you're not a financial expert or a stock market expert, but do you think China's stock market is going to go up in the next few months because China is coming out of the shadow of COVID-19?
So China's stock market goes up or down, not because of underlying economic conditions, but because it goes up and down because people are looking at the government. If they think the government is going to put money in, push money into stocks, encourage the market to go up, it will go up. So I wouldn't be surprised to see it go up, because I think China is going to roll out at some point in the not too distant future a stimulus package, a package designed to sort of lift the market, but it will not be people will be responding not to market signals, but to government signals. The market's much smaller, capitalization's much lower. A lot of money is speculative, chasing a pretty small market.
And another issue related to that, Ricardo asks, are we seeing the large COVID-19 disinformation campaign that unfortunately is happening to a degree in the United States? And do you think this highlights education as a key national security issue and vulnerability for the U.S.?
Yeah, it is, right? And it's not just Chinese disinformation. There's some of that. There's Russian, but there's sort of good old homegrown American disinformation. Please do not get your education from Facebook, right? It is a delightful way of keeping in touch with friends. If you see things on Facebook, check other sources. Choose your multiple sources. The only way to fight disinformation is through education and sort of a culture of caring about the sources of your information.
And another, this is a broader question, but obviously you have an entire career in the State Department as in the Foreign Service. Someone asked, Dennis asked, with so many dedicated career Foreign Service officials having left in the last few years, can you comment on why there's been an exodus and whether or not this creates a sort of risk for our country? such as a weaker or kind of less experienced foreign service?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have, if you have been an American diplomat for a couple of decades and believe in the mission of American leadership in the world, there has been, and this has not just been a Trump administration thing, although it certainly has accelerated under Trump, a decline in the willingness of, or sort of, I would say, foreign policy has been pulled into domestic political arguments much more than it was even when I joined the State Department in 1990. And I think so there has been that as the background. But, quite frankly, under the Trump administration, there has been an exercise in dismantling American leadership, getting out of organizations like the Paris Agreement,
Paris Accords, and TPP,
right.
and yeah.
That's right. And a lot of people didn't sign up for that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a difficulty. I mean, I think a lot of ways our country, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or moderate, I think you can attest to it. Most people, if you get to know enough people in the Foreign Service or in the intelligence agencies and the military, most of them, they leave their politics at the door, and they honestly do their best to serve the country. I mean, would you say that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely.
There are exceptions.
I would say the average Foreign Service officer is deeply conservative with a small c, which is, people leave their politics on the door, but recognize that it's, our role is to conserve American power, to preserve American strength and influence. And with at least what sort of fundamentally motivated me and structured my thinking is, we know what happens when people don't pay attention to global systems. They break down. We know what happens when there isn't global leadership. There's a global struggle for leadership. There have been very clear price to pay for the United States that have gone with global leadership, but just a real concern that there's going to be a price to pay for a lack of global leadership, a vacuum of global leadership. And, China is stepping up. They see a vacuum there, and I think they very consciously are stepping up into a space that we are leaving open.
And I think those other spaces, Putin's very happy to step into as well, unfortunately. I think that's part of what we try to do here at the Council is be a nonpartisan organization, but emphasize the need and necessity for American leadership. And if we're not leading the kind of, to be, the free world, then other people are happy to do so. Just to turn to another question from our audience. Someone asks, and we did an entire topic on this before back in December, some of you might remember, but the fate of the Uyghurs, a large Muslim minority group in Xinjiang in Western China that have been repressed. The estimates are over 1 million have been interned in, quote unquote, re-education camps. Can you talk about, he asks, what's the level of healthcare for, say, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province? And, things were already difficult. Has this COVID-19 made it that much worse?
I can only assume yes. I don't know. In terms of, our Uyghurs sort of, is that part of I frankly don't know. But my hunch is that China's a pretty technocratic place when it comes down to administration, and they recognize that while human beings may recognize creed and religion and national borders, that the coronavirus doesn't. And so, allowing the coronavirus to spread among the Uyghur population is going to be bad for the Han Chinese population. It's going to be bad for China. So my instinct is that they recognize that dealing with coronavirus means you've got to deal with it everywhere, not just with the people you like.
And Brian asked a question touching upon what we discussed previously. He asks, and what's your view of our recent decisions to cut off funding to the WHO? And what do you think China's perspective and reaction might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's crazy, right? I mean, we are, you know, WHO. Look, I think there's room for critiquing the head of the WHO and his unwillingness to get into a sort of open dispute with the Chinese about their initial response and their transparency. But the WHO is how the world responds and coordinates a response to a global crisis like this. And so, you know, to cut it off, and again, sort of like my answer to the last question, you know, dealing with the coronavirus here in the US, but not paying attention to what's happening everywhere else in the world is incredibly short-sighted, because it's going to get back here. You know, that we're going to have to deal with it globally. And of course, China sees this as a gigantic opportunity, right? You know, that sort of an own goal by the United States that allows China to step forward at really no cost at all to them and take leadership of an issue that the entire world cares about.
And Mark asks, you know, a good question. I suppose, can you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative? Just maybe, I know we don't have a lot of time, but very briefly what it is. And do you think China coming out of COVID-19, especially once their economy kind of gets its feet again, will double down on foreign investments?
Yeah, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is it depends on sort of what statistics you look at, but I mean, at least at the level of ambition, it's gigantic, trillions of dollars, you know, dozens and dozens of countries building out infrastructure, and you know, essentially for a 5-year period, anything that China was spending money, either private sector or public sector, sort of semi-private sector through state-owned enterprises, and often even private sector, got a BRI tag put on it because that was the flavor of the day in sort of the Chinese politics. There was a backlash against BRI, both overseas, as countries realized the deals they were getting weren't quite as good as promised, but also in China, as they realized that a lot of these investments were dogs, they were money losers, and they weren't going anywhere. And so, you know, I think that will be, you know, China will be humbled to some extent in its ambition. First of all, because they realize that there were a lot of problems there, but also because they're now going to have a lot of domestic problems just economically. I'm not sure, you know, that the BRI was not the money spinner that they were hoping it would be, and I think COVID-19 is going to make it worse.
And another great question from a student, Stephen. I think he's a student at the University of Texas in Austin. He asked, what do you think the chances are, the outlook for some degree of democratization after President Xi? Whenever, who knows how long he'll be there, but afterwards.
Define after.
Well, I mean that's the challenge. I mean, the term limits are gone, but let's say if he retired, you know, after his next term, say.
Yeah, I think it's vanishingly unlikely to go in that sort of a time frame, to go from Xi Jinping to sort of immediately into some kind of sort of without a cataclysmic political upheaval. But I think the likely outcome of that would not be democracy, but chaos. You know, that the Communist Party has been really good at keeping down alternatives to it. And so, you know, were it to sort of fall into internal fighting or that sort of thing, what you'd have is chaos, not something else emerge. And I don't think you're going to have a Chinese Communist Party leader come out of after Xi and put in place ideas that look anything like that we would recognize as democratic. I mean, they might sort of be a little more internal party democracy, where there's more of a consultative system, or you get back more to the consultative and more consensus-based politics that prevailed under Deng and up until the end of Xi's predecessor, but I think very unlikely.
And lastly, I always like to have more questions from students. And again, if for any of you, say, 7th or 8th grade students or high school students, I highlight again, we're opening our first ever Global Scholars Academy in July. We'll have a lot of incredible experts like Ambassador Rank in person for you to talk to, and former ambassadors and diplomats and former members of the CIA and FBI and DEA, journalists, business leaders, a great variety of people. Please join us. And Ahmad asks, what tips would you give for a student interested in studying international relations and perhaps a career in the Foreign Service?
So if you are interested in the Foreign Service, I will say the thing that you can give yourself and no one can take away is learning a foreign language and learning the culture that's connected with it. So yeah, and it's particularly the State Department. I can talk best about the State Department. You know, when we dealt with the intelligence services, with the CIA and the other, the rest of the intelligence community, they got tons of money. They got lots of personnel. They got neat gadgets, that sort of thing. The Department of Defense has airplanes. They got tanks. They got aircraft carriers. All we have is what we know about the country. You know, our exposure to the culture and the language, but that's important. And you know, knowing the country, knowing the people, knowing the language you know, we will have new technology and that sort of thing, but you know, that's something that we will always rely on people for, and invest in that.
Would you, I suppose, recommend, you know, even if it, you know, financially might be a challenge, to do any form of studying abroad or working abroad to get that cultural as well as, you know, lingual immersion?
So I can, again, only speak for myself. I was a schlub from the University of Illinois. I sort of managed to stagger out of college with a bachelor's degree, but not much more. The Taiwan Ministry of Education somehow plucked me out of obscurity, gave me a scholarship to study in Taiwan. I studied Chinese. I passed the Foreign Service test while I was there, and went on from there. And it was really a transformational experience. I had never been overseas. Well, I was as a very, very little kid, but you know, both in terms of sort of opening my eyes to the rest of the world, but also sort of opening a future to a career that I would have never considered before that. So,
well, that is great. And again, I just want to thank you all for joining us. And with this video, shortly, probably in an hour or two, will be up on our YouTube channel once we have a chance to kind of you know, put it all together. And all of our videos of you know, previous events, for instance, last year with you know, former Secretary of Defense and General Mattis or Nikki Haley, perhaps a future Vice President or President. Those events are on our YouTube channel, and we invite you all to subscribe, and please join us next week for our live events as well. And please, you know, do what you can to kind of keep your minds open, think about things from different perspectives. If you're a conservative, read a liberal paper. If you're a liberal, read a conservative paper. And thank you all for joining us, and will please join me in thanking Ambassador Rank. Thank you.
Ronan, thank you very much. This was great. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you.